Dr. Annette Doherty. Annette has had an illustrious career in the pharmaceutical sector at Warner Brothers, Warner and Lambert, Pfizer, Warner Brothers. That would be nice. That's me doing the show today. And most recently at GSK as Senior Vice President for Global Product Development and Clinical Products. Annette is also a chair of the NHS Trust at Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells, and also non-executive at the Cambridge University Hospital NHS Trust. She received her OBE for services to the pharmaceutical sector and took over as the Office of the President of Royal Society of Chemistry in July of 2024. So please put your hands together to welcome Annette.
Thank you so much, Anju. I don't know how you remembered all that. It's a great pleasure for me to be here today and to welcome all of you to this really important conference. These sorts of events really inspire me because they bring together academia, industry, and government. And together we are working on what is a very important problem, all about our sustainability agenda for the future. I wanted to begin by sort of saying that, the chemicals, pollution and climate change are two areas where people are crying out for change, and they are expecting us, and it is our obligation to make a big difference here in the coming years. I personally worked in both in the discovery end of the pharmaceutical sector business, but also in product development and in formulation development. So I know a fair bit about the sorts of things that we put into our formulations in developing medicines. And I know how difficult of a challenge it is going to be to make changes that are sustainable, but also that can be regulated effectively and can be scaled in the manufacturing space. So all of those things will be important. And I know that today there are many people here from different parts of the chemical industry, and I welcome you. PLFs obviously are a key part of the whole puzzle with regard to climate change and sustainability. And I was quite surprised, to be honest, some of these statistics I wouldn't have been aware of before today. 36 million tons of PLFs produced annually. And as Anya said, most of those are derived from fossil fuels. And actually, they're a group of chemicals that very few people have actually heard of, but we know that they're in pretty much everything that we use on a daily basis, from the shampoo that we use to wash our hair to the paint we put on our walls. Obviously, because they are produced from fossil fuels and virtually none are recovered, and Angie spoke about circularity, and I know there's some really good talks here today on circularity and being able to recycle if we can't replace. But they do build up in our soil and in our waterways, and some of although there are significant risks, some of them are not even known, those risks to human health and to the environment. And of course, there's a financial cost, and I apologize for this being in dollars, but while PLFs are quite low volume chemicals, they are commercially important to all of our sectors that we work in, and together they are worth an immense $1.27 trillion. So commercially very important products are developed across all our industries, and so it's a huge piece of work. And the value that PLFs that are used and not recovered each year adds up to $125 billion. So the case for change is clear. It's no exaggeration to say that we believe PLFs will be the next revolution in sustainability. And we know that enabling these kinds of changes in industrial processes is complex, multifaceted, and will require lots of technological innovation, new regulatory frameworks, and investments in infrastructure, as well as new business models. And as I said at the beginning, the importance of collaboration between industry, academia, and government is absolutely critical for our success. Now, we're delighted with the level of engagement represented by you and the wider community. with regard to all of the stakeholders across the systems with PLFs, which have been developed by industry and by experts such as you. And when we launched the roadmap last year, setting out 2 key missions that will support fully sustainable PLFs by 2040. The first is to develop and scale biodegradable PLFs by 2030, and the second to advance the circular economy infrastructure, also by 2030. And we did, when we started this work, we intended the roadmap to be a catalyst for system-wide change, because that's what will be essential for success here and maximal impact. And I'm really pleased to report that we've seen fantastic signs of progress in working together. So far, £36 million worth of research and innovation projects focused on sustainable PLFs have been developed, and many of which are supported by UK public funding, some of whom are represented today. We'll be hearing from some of those projects from our speakers today. So we're also working with other organisations to put PLFs firmly on the government's strategic agenda. The availability of alternatives to fossil fuel feedstocks is one of the greatest challenges that we have, as it is for other key sustainability goals. We've joined forces with the Royal Society, the Bio-Based Industries Association, Innovate UK, and Pioneer Group to raise the profile of PLFs as part of the ambition to defossilise the chemicals industry. And to be honest, I do feel that joint voices across multiple organisations interested and with the expertise to really develop new materials and new alternatives to fossil fuel PLFs is critical. We need a single voice in the way in which we influence and gain support on the government agenda. So we will also work to support sustainable chemicals regulation and policy. In our final session today, we're going to be hearing how we're doing on regulation, because that's going to be a really complex area too. But to highlight a couple of examples, we're campaigning for the creation of a UK chemicals agency to enable a more streamlined, coherent and effective regulatory framework that enhances the UK's position as a leading scientific nation, delivering taxpayer value for money and helping to protect the health and the environment. And we are engaging closely with the UN Science Policy Panel on chemicals, waste and pollution prevention and the new global framework on chemicals. And we had a really successful conference last week on our science policy panel and all of the work that's ongoing on waste, chemicals, and pollution control. Again, multifactorial and collaboration across industry, academia and government. You can find out more about the work that is happening to support sustainable PLFs by browsing our interactive map of activities, which you can view on a Miro board at the back of this room. I'm not quite sure where it is, but maybe you'll be told a little bit later. But thank you very much for your support and for playing your part. While none of us have any of the individual solutions, really, I firmly believe that as we work together, we will transform the PLFs sector by 2040. And on that note, I'd like to hand over to Anna Birney, CEO of the School of Systems Change, to share more on what it will take to drive system-wide transformation, which is surely critical. So a big welcome to you, Anna, and thank you very much for being with us here today.
I think my role here is to zoom out, to set a bit of context about what is the nature of the change that we want to create here. What does it mean to take a system-wide approach to delivering this mission? I'm not a chemical expert, I'm not in this industry, but I have worked across multiple industries over the last 25 years. And the first question when we zoom out is we ask the question is, why do we even need to take a systems approach? What is the context? And at the School of Systems Change, we really say that, we need to learn how to lead change in this complex world. I was only reading the newspaper the other day, and on one page I saw, a story about how obesity was being created by high processed food and how, this was a huge problem to our society. And then on another page, I saw how the NHS was looking at diet pills. And these two things seemed at odd, you know, how we were trying to kind of put sticking plasters on bigger problems, and the system-wide issue of addressing food systems, of health systems, and how these things come together was not being there. We kind of see the events, we see the issues in the world, but we don't get under the surface. We don't look at the complexity of what's required and trying to unlock the change. But a simple way of saying it is the world is actually really complex. The world is interconnected. It's often quite hard to understand, but then we get into the room and we try to find the A to B solutions. So my job today is to try to give you a few stimuluses, a few ideas about how we might think in systems, how this affects how we create change, and how we're applying it to the PLF's mission. And what does this mean for perhaps going forwards? How do you catalyse and how do you cultivate change? So just to be clear, there are many solutions in the world that just are complicated, are clear solutions that have obvious ways of addressing them. Okay, so how do you get to the moon? Very hard to get to the moon. It's a complicated problem, but actually there's a solution. There's an answer to it. There's some things that we do all the time, simple solutions, how to bake a cake. We've done it. There's best practices. We can really refine it. There's chaotic problems. COVID was one of those when it arrived and we don't quite know how to do it. But what I'm talking about here is complex issues where there probably are ways that we can address it, things that we can do, but we need to work it out together. We need to find the emergent practice. We need to sense the system. We need to find ways to move forward. So that's what we're talking about today, the complexity of sustainability. I've worked in sustainability for over 25 years, and all of these problems, from climate change to social justice issues, are really complex. And my favourite quote, no, not that one. Oh, sorry, did you not? Sorry, I didn't realise it was a flick through. Did you see? So that's the model there. Apologies for that. My favourite quote about why we need to take a systems approach from Danilo Meadows, who is a systems dynamics academic, said the world is complex, interconnected, finite, ecological, social, psychological, economic system. And this is the critical bit. But we treat it as if it's not, as if it's divisible, separable, simple, infinite. And our persistent, intractable global problems like sustainability arise directly from this mismatch. The world is complex and yet we find simple solutions to it. And this is kind of the why we need to try to find different approaches to what we do. So how does change happen in that context in a complex world? One way, when we teach people and we work with people, we often think in metaphors about how the world works. What metaphor do you use when you think about change, when you think about the way the world works? Do you think of an army marching forward? Do you think of a family system? Do you think of mechanics and cogs in a system? And a lot of our economic systems and business systems and governance systems often uses that metaphor of mechanics, of trying to solve problems. But what we talk about is we need to take a living systems approach. We need to understand the world in its just natural complexity. And the world as a living system has a few principles, and actually quite simple principles that we can start to live by. Firstly, that we are humans, and while social systems are nested in our living world. And this is really critical when we think of issues like PLFs. When we think of sustainability issues, we often miss the point that our social systems are part of an ecological world. And that the pattern that connects us is happening at the micro level and the macro level. That the world is constantly moving and relating dynamically, that there's constant exchanges between things, and that's why we need to be looking at things like circularity and about how we understand the world as exchange, but not just in the ecological world, but also in the social world. You know, how do we do business? How do we exchange? How do we start negotiating and agreeing on differences? And the world changes through emergence. And what I mean by that is we often think in that cartoon from A to B, that the world doesn't happen through A to B. It happens through jumps, through starts. Lots of times things look like they're not happening at all, and then suddenly the system shifts. And that's almost what we're trying to do today. So we're trying to create the conditions so the system can shift. What do we do on the surface that might take a few years, might take to 2040 to really feel that change, but we know that that effort is kind of creating the change we want to see. And we are lucky, we're human creatures who have the consciousness, the ability to self-reflect. So we're here to self-reflect today to think about how do we start to change this system. So how does change happen? There are multiple models. We teach models and frameworks at the school. We bring them to strategy processes, to change processes. And there's a few principles and ways that we might think about it. That change happens at multiple levels. That what we might do at the small level, innovate here, we want to affect the regime, we want to affect the mainstream. What might happen at the landscape, the trends, the issues that are affecting us in the world, are influencing the dynamics. So how do we start thinking, the zooming in, the zooming out across these issues? How do we think about change happens in waves over time? That what's happening today will not exist into the future. What happens into the future, there might be small pockets of it today. So how do we start thinking in change over time, thinking that things are possible, that we can actually change the system? How do we start thinking in fractals? This idea that whatever happens at a small scale can reverberate into a larger scale. And so there's something about how do these projects like the PLFs project become a demonstrator, start demonstrating new models, demonstrating how it's possible, not just in one innovation, one action, but as a whole system. How do we create a new system, a new demonstration of how things might work that then can be scaled, then can be moved through the system? So scale then happens not through individual things working, but it's about how all of those multiple experiments come together. It scales through the fractal patterns, about the reconfigurating and the connecting between things. So how do we use these living system principles of fractals, of waves over time, of working at multiple levels, of dynamic relationships to really affect how we create change? And if any of you have done management schools or have been in different learning environments, you'll know that a lot of the way that we, public management as well, a lot of the way that we learn about change in the world and the way we try to implement it is not through a lot of these principles. A lot of it is trying to be through log frames that A equals B equals C, and then we'll get to D. And what we're trying to teach is how do we start to bring some of these different framings to the way we create change. So what does that mean practically? Well, a lot of you in this room are talking about innovation, and we're used to the S-curve, that we've got a challenge, we diagnose it, we innovate, and we're looking for this impact, to scale up our impact, to sustain momentum, to create a new mainstream for the transformation required. And there's this magic middle, this thing in the middle, we're like, okay, but what happens? We scale, and this word, we're like, okay, how does that happen? What actually goes about? And I think what's missing is often that this scaling process is not just a case of replication or just a case of scaling out, of doing more of something, because we're applying that current mindset of just do more, just grow to it. It's actually about the reconfigurating of the system. How does policy work with innovation? How does new capacities come along? How do new relationships form? How do new business models come into being? How do these things work as a reconfigurating of the building blocks of the system, rather than just seeing it as a scale of we have these individual pathways to creating change? And this starts to invite you in this room to start to think about what relationships can I make today? How do I connect people? How does somebody's knowledge, how does somebody's experience, how does the work that they're doing connect in? How do we start to form a new system here today to start to move from just doing innovative ideas and projects to actually creating a new system together? And so there's a lot of different frameworks and configurations of how we might start talking about change and working with change, from working in the niche and in the startup place, creating collaborations, looking at different cases for change, different behaviours, different financing mechanisms, developing new rules in the system. And this thinking about the different ways and places we can create change is something we've been applying to the PLF agenda. And we've been working with the Royal Society of Chemistry to think about, okay, we've got an amazing roadmap. We've got an amazing roadmap, and we've got the pillars, and we've got the understanding of where we want to be in 2040, but how do we get there? And this is what we're transitioning to now. How do we start working together? How do we start thinking about how do we move forward and working together? Because we often think of systems change as the outcome, the change of the pattern we want to get to. But we also need to think about it as systems change as the process of how we cultivate change and the practices that are required. So as I say, we have the outcome with the roadmap, the building blocks. We've articulated that. It's quite clear of what's required. But we need to think about what is that process of the building blocks that are required in this initiative to create change. And in the report, they identified 4 different pillars or building blocks that need to come together as a combination of actions and areas of, yes, applied research and innovations, thinking about where collaboration will work, how research and how policy and regulation can work, and what the knowledge is and the capacity is to create that change. So I won't go into the detail of this today, but we've been mapping out the potential roles in that transition. What are the things, and this might not be complete, there might be other roles that you want to be adding, other things that you are doing in the room, but we've been just thinking through, what is it? What does it mean to develop new solutions and close the gap in research? What does it mean to create horizontal integration through collaboration to reshape the system? What's the role of the Royal Society in supporting you? What are you also doing? What are all your roles in supporting this change? How do we influence policy and regulation? How do we do that collectively rather than individually? How does our voice become more than the sum of our parts? So some of these things about how do we convene people, how do we bring advice, how do we identify problems, how do we collaborate, are really the work of systems change. And we don't often value that and don't often see it in the work that we do. So I'm just going to end on one last section because it's almost my passion. And the thing that often gets missed in a lot of this work is the role of organisations like the Royal Society of Chemistry or others I've worked with over the last 25 years. How do we catalyse, how do we value the work of bringing people together? And yes, we bring people together in summits, but it's also all of you together today to kind of think about the conversations, the relationships you want to build to support the change, to be a field catalyst, to help mobilise, galvanise, and create change toward that shared goal. So we talk about systems change as, yes, defining the system, understanding the problem, creating the strategy, delivering interventions. But the thing that I really want to emphasize is we often forget the social process, the group dynamics, the people and how they come together. So this is really important, what we're talking about today, because we're individuals kind of floating around the space and doing different things. And the role of what we're trying to do here, and I'm supporting the Royal Society of Chemistry do, is how do we move to, how do they help you as an intermediary create and support the kind of new building and the ecosystem and the connections between you? Because every attempt to write a new human story converges upon one mundane, heartbreaking problem. How shall we come together? How do we work together? How do we create together? How shall we organise? And as I said, I've worked on multiple projects in multiple ways, from shipping to marine, plastics and issues, from beauty and personal health hair, from looking at chemicals actually with Nike, Puma and Adidas and the Chinese government and trying to remove chemicals from the value chains, from food issues in landscapes and across protein. So I've worked on a huge amount of different projects. And there are a couple of things I just want to highlight that we forget about or we don't always value in the process of creating change. The first one is about relationships. We don't always value their cultivation enough. We don't always value the time it takes. I was just interviewing people for the Sustainable Trade Initiative, and they work across countries across the world, and I was interviewing them about how do they create change. And they said it took in the Congo Basin 5 years to get the relationships together to actually understand how cassava was harvested and what was happening, to talk to warlords, to talk to farmer associations, the time it takes to build those relationships. So a lot of the relationships here probably you might know people, you might meet new people. How do we value that cultivation? Because is that moment, that moment where you're in the room at the right time, you have that idea, you find that connection. And let's not underestimate that as a critical part of change. But also we need to find the right business model, the valuing of this work, the saying that this work needs the resources to create the change. Because this is a colleague of mine who ran a project called Civil Society Futures, a social issue across the UK, and she drew out the real process of change. She was saying we did in the proposal, we had, the lovely linear model, but she was actually saying, well, this is what's happening. This is the nature of the conversation, the jumping between, the kind of trying to organise, the trying to work out, how do we bring people together? And also, how do we start to govern? How do we start to work between different organisations? And I think that is part of the invitation as you get to the end of the day today. How do you start to think about all your different roles, all the things you're contributing, how you might start working together, moving towards governance and a way of how you want to organise, not just thinking about the hard stuff of innovation, but also thinking about the soft stuff. So that's my talk today. A little bit of a zooming out, a little bit of a framing, not talking about the issue, but really framing up some of those ideas and framings of how you might create change, why you're here today, and kind of inviting you into the space of coming together to create change on this quite ambitious agenda. So thank you very much.